It started with the sound of gravel crunching beneath heavy tires, a sound that didn't belong in the silence of my lake cabin. I was supposed to be alone. That was the entire point of this place. Tucked deep in the woods, reachable only by a winding dirt road that hadn't been maintained in years. The cabin sat beside a still, dark lake that mirrored the pine trees like a sheet of polished obsidian. I came here to escape people like Karen. But even out here, somehow, she found me. Karen, the self-appointed queen of our homeowners association, had long since decided that rules mattered more than people. She enforced bylaws with the zeal of a tax auditor on a power trip. The kind of woman who measured grass height with a ruler. But now, she'd taken things too far. And I wasn't even sure she understood how far. 3 months before the cabin incident, I told the HOA I was taking a sabbatical. Burned out from work, disconnected from everything, I wanted peace. I emailed the HOA, told them I'd be unreachable, off-grid, out of sight. Karen replied with her usual clipped tone. Please ensure your property is maintained in your absence. It was more a warning than a request. I ignored it. Apparently, Karen didn't. I heard the door to the truck slam, followed by another. Then muffled voices, men, laughing and talking in low tones. Hunting rifles clinked against their truck bed. My cabin, secluded and quiet for weeks, suddenly buzzed with an energy I hadn't invited. At first, I assumed they were just lost, maybe weekend hunters who'd taken a wrong turn. I stepped onto the porch, wearing flannel and holding a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. That's when I saw the men. 4 of them. All in camo, all heavily armed, one of them with a GoPro strapped to his chest like this was some kind of reality show. Hey, I called. This is private property. One of them turned and smirked. We've got permission. I blinked. Permission from who? From behind the group, a familiar nasal voice piped up. Karen. Dressed in her pristine beige parka and rubber boots, she stepped out from the other side of the truck as if she were leading a nature walk. She carried a clipboard. Of course she did. I've allowed them temporary access, she said, like this was her land. Your property hasn't been in compliance with HOA guidelines for over 60 days. The lawn is overgrown, and the shoreline is cluttered. We're enforcing Article 14b. Unmaintained properties can be entered for corrective action. I stared at her. Corrective action? You sent armed hunters. They're professionals, she replied with an infuriating smile. They also happen to be members of our HOA Volunteer Task Force. This isn't a war zone, Karen. No, but it could become one with the way you're neglecting the rules. I wanted to yell. I wanted to rip that clipboard from her hands and throw it into the lake. But something deeper stopped me. Not fear. Not yet. Just confusion. Something was off. The men weren't just here to mow the grass or take a few photos for the HOA newsletter. They were looking around too much. Scanning the tree line. One of them had binoculars. Another had a long, black case that didn't look like it held a weed trimmer. This isn't HOA business, I said carefully. Karen sniffed, not meeting my eyes. You brought this on yourself. If you hadn't gone dark, if you'd just kept your property up to code, none of this would have been necessary. Then one of the men walked past me, without a word, and started toward the back of the cabin. Hey, I snapped. You don't go in there. Karen raised her clipboard. He's inspecting the shed. There have been reports of illegal storage, flammable materials, possibly even unregistered tools. Tools. I repeated, incredulous. But I knew right then she wasn't talking about rakes and shovels. She was fishing. Or worse, she knew something. I didn't keep weapons here. I didn't even own a gun. But I had been working on a side project, a data rig, some encrypted drives. Nothing illegal. Just private. Research I didn't want traced or leaked. Research I told no one about. Except maybe, foolishly, my neighbor, before he sold his house and moved out. I started to walk after the man headed for the shed, but the one with the GoPro stepped in front of me. Let him do his job, he said flatly. That's when I felt the first ripple of fear. This wasn't about Elon. This wasn't about code violations or a cluttered dock. Karen had sent these guys in with a purpose. And either she knew what they were looking for, or someone had convinced her she did. I backed up toward the cabin door. You need a warrant to do this. We're not the police, she said sweetly. HOA guidelines give us temporary jurisdiction under emergency enforcement. Emergency enforcement, I repeated. What the hell does that mean? A sound interrupted us, distant at first, then growing louder. Not an animal. Not thunder. Sirens. Everyone froze. From across the lake, flashing lights glinted through the trees. Two black SUVs followed by an unmarked truck, all moving fast down the overgrown access road. The kind of vehicles you don't mistake for local sheriff or state troopers. These were federal. The kind of federal that doesn't use lights unless it has to. Karen turned to the hunters. What is this? But they weren't answering. In fact, one of them was already moving back toward their truck, dropping his rifle to the ground in panic. Another cursed under his breath and pulled a phone from his pocket. You lied, I said to Karen. You told them something to justify this. What did you say? That I was a threat. A terrorist. She looked pale. No. I only filed a notice. A complaint. But someone must have flagged it. The FBI SUVs screeched to a halt on the gravel, an armed agent spilled out, shouting orders, rifles raised. The hunters hit the ground instantly, hands up. Karen stood frozen, clutching her clipboard like it could shield her from what was coming. An agent in a windbreaker stormed up the path, pointing directly at me. Hands where I can see them. Now. I complied slowly, eyes wide. I live here. You were flagged in a federal cybercrime investigation. Step away from the house. I turned to Karen, who was now shaking. What did you tell them? I asked again. But she said nothing. And that's when I realized. She had no idea what kind of change she'd set in motion. The air around the lake had never felt so tense. After the initial shock of discovering the uninvited hunters trampling through my property, I thought the worst had passed. But I hadn't understood just how deep this whole thing went. The cabin, nestled in a quiet cove surrounded by tall pines and the hush of water lapping the dock, had always been my refuge. Now, it felt like a stage set for something much bigger, something dangerous. I watched from the shadows behind my woodshed as the men moved through the clearing with calculated steps. They weren't just weekend warriors or bored guys with rifles. Their gear was too professional, their demeanor too focused. The way they checked corners, radioed updates, and moved in formation told me this wasn't just a misguided hunting trip. And they were looking for something, maybe even someone. What unnerved me most was that they had the nerve to break into the cabin. They weren't interested in the pantry or a warm place to sleep. They tore through drawers, turned over rugs, lifted floorboards. One even pulled a small device from his pocket, a signal detector maybe, and ran it across the walls. That's when I knew. They thought there was something here. Something hidden. I backed away carefully, keeping out of sight. My phone, which had been dead earlier from a long day off-grid, finally buzzed after charging off the solar pack. A single bar of signal, just enough. I sent a brief, vague message to a friend in the bureau. Need eyes on lake property. Unauthorized armed group here. Urgent. I didn't expect a reply immediately, but it was a breadcrumb in the right direction. The next hour crawled. I circled the cabin at a distance, trying to count how many men were inside, how many stood guard, and whether they had set up cameras. That's when I saw one of them talking on a satellite phone, his voice just audible across the water. No sign of the ledger yet, but we'll find it. The old man had to stash it here. Ledger. That word echoed in my head. What ledger? The only old man connected to this cabin had been my grandfather. A reclusive veteran who passed it down to me before he died, with no mention of anything other than a love for fishing and solitude. But now I wondered, What had he been involved in? Why would these men believe he'd left behind something worth invading federal property for? I thought of Karen, the HOA president who'd always acted like she ran the world. The same Karen who once sent a notice because my canoe was improperly stored. She hated that I didn't attend the HOA meetings or let her boss me around. But this was a whole new level. I'd seen her talking to a stranger 2 weeks ago, a man with a military haircut and mirrored sunglasses. They spoke in hushed tones at the edge of the community garden. At the time, I brushed it off as more Karen drama. But what if she'd tipped these people off? What if she'd sold some half-baked rumor about a hidden stash to the wrong people? Suddenly, a low hum vibrated through the ground. It was faint but growing, a sound you don't forget if you've ever heard it before. Rotor blades. Fast. Multiple. I ducked under a fallen tree limb and stared upward. Through the break in the canopy, black shapes loomed. Helicopters, unmarked but unmistakable. The hunters heard them too. One of them shouted, "Move. We've got company." In moments, the clearing erupted. Men scrambled for weapons. One tried to torch the cabin. Why? I still don't know, but a sniper round shattered the gas canister in his hands. Another bolted for the trees and didn't get 10 feet before a team in tactical gear emerged from the brush like ghosts. Blue windbreakers. FBI. Bold and bright across their backs. Screams of, "Drop it!" and, "Down on the ground!" echoed through the woods. The air throbbed with the sound of boots, commands, and handcuffs snapping closed. I stayed low until I saw my friend, Agent Ramirez, scanning the tree line. I stepped out slowly, hands raised. "Took you long enough," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't smile. "You had people on a terrorist watch list in your damn cabin, Jake. What the hell is this place?" I didn't have an answer. Not yet. By the time the sun began to dip below the tree line, the hunters were zip-tied and hauled off in a convoy of black SUVs. Ramirez stayed behind with me, combing through the wreckage of my ransacked cabin. "You mentioned a ledger," I said finally. "They thought it was here." He nodded, arms crossed. "The man they were working for is ex-intelligence. Thinks your grandfather had records from an op back in the 80s. The kind of info that could put a lot of people behind bars. Financials, locations, names." I tried to picture my grandfather as anything but a cranky old man with a rod and reel. He never mentioned any of that. Ramirez glanced at the stone fireplace. "You sure? Sometimes those old guys, they hide things in plain sight." We found it hours later. A small compartment behind the mantel, sealed tight with a rusted latch. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was an old leather-bound book. The first page was a list of names I didn't recognize, but Ramirez's eyes widened. "This is it," he whispered. "Jesus, Jake." I sat down hard on the couch, which was now half shredded. The weight of it all finally hit me, what they'd been willing to do, the lies, the danger. The quiet lake was never just a lake. The cabin, not just a getaway. And Karen, she played a role in all this. Ramirez promised she'd be interviewed. I doubted she'd say much, but if she had knowingly tipped off armed mercs in pursuit of classified intel, she was in deep. I looked out the window toward the lake, moonlight shimmering on its surface like it always had. Except now I knew. Peace here had always been an illusion. Still, it was my home. And I wasn't about to give it up. Not to Karen. Not to mercenaries. Not to ghosts of the past.